She was his queen, his shield, the woman who bled beside him through 3 wars and never once asked what it cost her. And the moment his stepmother opened her mouth and called her a traitor, he believed it, didn't hesitate, didn't ask, just grabbed her by the wrist in front of every lord and warrior in the kingdom and had her thrown underground like an animal while the banquet music was still playing. That's the story they want you to forget. But we're not forgetting it. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to know where my people are watching from. Stay until the end. You're going to want to see what she does next. The banquet hall of Moonfang Keep had not smelled like blood in 11 years. Celine Raverin remembered the last time. She had been 19, barely a week into her role as the Alpha King's consort. Standing in the outer corridor with a hunting knife she'd taken off a dead guard and a dislocated shoulder she'd refused to mention to anyone. That night she'd stopped an assassination attempt that 3 of Kael's personal sentinels had missed entirely. She hadn't told him about the shoulder for 6 days. She hadn't wanted him to think she needed something. Now she was 31, and the hall smelled like blood again. And this time it was hers. Not yet. Not physically. But Celine had spent 12 years learning to read rooms the way other women read letters, and what the room was telling her right now, at the 3rd hour of the Royal Summit banquet, was that something had already been decided before she walked through the doors. She noticed it in the seating arrangement first. Lord Casson of the Ironback clan had been placed 2 chairs closer to Kael than their territorial rank warranted. Lord Heron, whose clan bordered the eastern mountains and who had spent the last decade quietly supporting the Queen's trade initiatives, had been pushed to the far end of the second table. Small things. The kind of repositioning that meant someone had gotten to the seating master 2 days ago, minimum. She noticed it in the way the servants moved too. The ones who had worked the keep for years. The ones who knew her by name, who occasionally slipped dried figs onto her reading desk when she worked late. Most of them were not here tonight. The faces behind the wine carafes were unfamiliar. New placements, all of them, and they kept their eyes pointed somewhere around the level of her collarbone. Nobody looked her in the face. "You're doing the thing again," said a low voice beside her. Bryn, her personal guard. 11 years of service, forearms like ship rope, and the unsettling habit of reading Celine's tension before Celine had finished feeling it herself. "What thing?" Celine said. "Counting exits." "I always count exits." "You're doing it faster than usual." Celine lifted her wine cup and did not drink from it. Something's off about tonight. Bryn's jaw shifted. She was standing at the wall behind the Queen's chair, arms loose, but her weight had already redistributed to her front foot. Lady Morwen arrived 3 hours early, before even the outer clan lords. She brought her own attendants. "I know." "You didn't say anything." "I was hoping I was wrong." Bryn didn't answer that. They both understood what it meant when Celine hoped she was wrong about something. It meant she was almost certainly not wrong. At the head table, Kael Draven was laughing at something Lord Casson had said. He had the laugh he used for politics, full-throated, the kind that reached the back of the room. And Celine watched him deploy it with the practiced ease of a man who had been performing authority since he was 16. He was 43 now. The gray at his temples had come in heavy this past winter, and she'd told him once that it suited him, and he'd looked at her the way he sometimes did when he thought she was mocking him and hadn't been able to decide, and eventually he'd accepted it as a compliment because she'd held his gaze long enough that he couldn't do anything else. They had not been easy, these 12 years. That was the truth nobody said at feasts. He was hard. The way iron was hard, not cruel exactly, but with no give to him, no flex. And if you pressed against him at the wrong angle, you'd cut yourself on him before either of you had time to notice. She had learned the angles. She had also learned that the hardness came from something that had happened to him long before she arrived in his life, something that lived in the space between his shoulder blades when he slept, something that surfaced as pride and contempt, and the specific brittleness of a man who had been taught early that needing anything was the same as weakness. She had chosen him anyway. She had chosen to stay. She told herself it was because the kingdom needed her. That was true. It was not the only true thing, but she'd gotten practiced at not examining the others. Lady Morwen sat to Kael's left, 3 seats down, which was the precise position of honored guest without being the position of family. She was 61, and built like a woman who had survived the thing that killed everyone around her and drawn the right conclusions. Her hair was still dark, which Celine had always privately suspected was managed, and her face held the kind of stillness that was not calm but control. She had been Kael's stepmother for 22 years. She had never once, in all of Selene's time in this keep, said anything that could be proven to be an attack. That was what made her dangerous. Tonight she was wearing deep wine red, which was the color of the house she'd come from before she'd married Kael's father, a house that had been formally dissolved and stripped of territory 8 years ago, following accusations of border tampering that had never been fully prosecuted. Nobody had mentioned that when she'd been invited to the summit. Celine had noticed. She had mentioned it to Kael 3 weeks ago, and he had told her she was seeing conspiracies in old fabric, and she had looked at him and calculated, as she sometimes did, the precise cost of pushing harder versus the cost of letting it sit. She had let it sit. She was going to have to stop doing that. The first course came and went, the second course arrived, and the noise level in the hall climbed, as it always did when enough wine circulated through enough men who'd spent their days performing restraint. Celine ate almost nothing. She watched the room. It was during the third course that she saw Lord Heron stand up from the far end of the second table, excuse himself to the outer corridor, and not come back. She gave him 8 minutes. When he hadn't returned, she stood herself. "I need to speak with Lord Heron," she said quietly to Bryn. "Alone. He's in the east corridor." Bryn said, "Take Veth and Os. 2 guards following me through my own keep sends a message I don't want to send tonight. And a queen alone in a corridor sends a different message." Celine considered this. "You, just you." They slipped out through the servants' passage behind the tapestry, which Celine had used since her second year in the keep because it cut 3 minutes off the walk to the eastern wing, and because no one who wanted to ambush her would expect her to appear from inside the wall. Heron was in the alcove at the corridor's bend, and he had the look of a man who had been rehearsing what he was about to say and no longer trusted any of the words. He was 50-something, gravel-faced, with a scar that split his left eyebrow and a reputation as the most cautious territorial lord in the Eastern Alliance. Not cautious as in afraid, cautious as in a man who measured every word 3 times before he let it loose, who had survived 4 successive Alpha Kings by being precisely as useful as necessary and never more visible than safe. He looked, right now, like he was about to be more visible than safe. "My queen," he said. "My lord." She stopped 2 feet from him. "You left before the wine toast. I needed air. You needed to tell me something without being seen doing it." His jaw worked. He glanced at Bryn, who had posted herself at the corridor's mouth with her back to them. "There are letters," Heron said. "I was told 3 days ago by a source I trust that letters were found. In your private chambers." Celine felt the floor shift under her the way it did before a structural collapse. Not a dramatic crack, but a subtle wrongness, a vibration in the foundation that meant something had already given way. "What kind of letters?" she said. "Correspondence." He wouldn't look at her directly. "With the Greyclaw clan, and with the Vorthan border lords." He paused. "The kind that discusses favorable terms, after a transition." "A transition of power." "Yes." The corridor was cold. Moonfang Keep was always cold in the northern corridors, even in high summer, because the stone had been quarried from mountain rock that held winter in it like a memory. Celine had learned, years ago, to stop noticing the cold. She noticed it now. "Those letters don't exist," she said. "I believe you." "But someone has them." Heron finally looked at her. "Someone has what looks like them. My source says they're in your writing, your seal. That's not possible. I know that. But Lord Casson doesn't, or is choosing not to. And Lady Morwen—" He stopped. "Lady Morwen," Celine said quietly, "has been building toward this for a long time." He didn't deny it. "How many of the Summit Lords have been told about these letters?" she asked. "I don't know for certain. Enough that the information will move tonight one way or another." He exhaled. "My queen, if it comes out in that hall, there will be no ability to manage the response. You know how he—" He stopped again. She knew what he hadn't finished. She knew how Kael was in public accusation. She had seen it once before, 7 years ago, when a treasury minister had been accused of skimming trade levies. Kael had not waited for investigation. He'd had the man confined before the words were finished leaving the accuser's mouth, and it had turned out, 6 weeks later, that the evidence had been misread, and the minister had been innocent, and Kael had compensated the family and never, ever discussed it again. The minister had lost 2 years of his life, and his younger son had never fully forgiven the king. Celine understood, standing in that cold corridor with Heron's eyes on her, that she had perhaps 40 minutes before whatever was coming came, possibly less. "Go back in," she said. "Sit down. Don't defend me publicly tonight, not yet. It'll mark you and I need you functional. Watch Lady Morwen's eyes when it starts. Remember what you see." Heron hesitated. "My queen, go." He went. Bryn had heard all of it. She turned from the corridor entrance, and her face was the face she used when she was calculating fast. "We should send word to Commander Adric. Adric answers to the king, same as every commander. He also has 20 years of loyalty to you personally, and he knows it. If I call in a personal loyalty right now, before anything has happened, it looks like I'm fortifying. It gives shape to accusations that don't have shape yet." Celine was already moving back toward the servants' passage. "We go back in. We sit down. We let it come, and we respond to what it actually is rather than what we're afraid it might be. That is," Bryn said carefully, walking behind her, "a strategy that requires the king to behave rationally." Celine did not answer that. They came back through the tapestry and into the heat and noise of the banquet hall, and Celine took her seat and picked up her wine cup and watched Lady Morwen across the room. And Lady Morwen, for just a moment, looked back at her. It was not a triumphant look. It was something flatter than triumph. The look of a woman for whom this had stopped being personal a long time ago and become simply work. Celine thought, she's been patient, 22 years patient, and now she's decided it's time. She set the wine cup down and folded her hands in her lap and prepared to survive the next hour. It did not take an hour. It took 20 minutes. The hall was at the height of its third-course noise when Lady Morwen stood. She did not raise her voice immediately. She simply stood, and the way she stood, the stillness of it, the deliberateness, pulled attention to her the way a sudden silence pulls attention, because something about her posture communicated that what was about to happen was important enough that she had been saving it. "My lords," she said when the room had quieted enough, "I apologize for interrupting the evening, but there is a matter that cannot wait until morning." Kael looked at her from the head of the table. His expression was the one he wore when he was being patient with something he hadn't yet decided was worth his impatience. "Lady Morwen, this isn't the appropriate—" "I have proof," she said, "that your queen has been in private communication with the Greyclaw clan and the Vorthen border lords for the purpose of facilitating a change of leadership in this territory." The room went so silent that Celine could hear the candles. "I have the letters," Morwen continued, "in her writing, with her seal, discussing terms of support for an outside claim on the Moonfang throne in exchange for territorial protections after the transition." She paused. "I did not want to believe it. I investigated for 3 weeks before I brought this forward. I have brought it forward now because to wait longer would be to allow the damage to continue." Kael had gone very still. Celine knew that stillness. She had learned it in year 2 of their marriage, when she'd come to understand that it was not the stillness of a man considering options. It was the stillness of a man who had already moved inside his own head to a place where the options were finished and something simpler had taken over. She stood. "That's a lie," she said. Her voice came out level. She had practiced level voices in difficult moments for 12 years. "Those letters are fabricated. I have had no communication with Greyclaw or Vorthen outside of officially documented trade discussions. Lady Morwen can place writing and a seal in my name. That doesn't make what they say true." "The letters were found in your private chamber," Morwen said. She was not raising her voice either. 2 women across a banquet hall not raising their voices while the room watched. Not slipped somewhere they'd be found, hidden, inside the false back of your writing cabinet. A sound moved through the gathered lords. Not words, just the breath of collective realization. "I have had access to that cabinet for 12 years, Celine said. "Anyone with access to my chambers could have placed something in it. Lady Morwen was in my chambers 4 days ago when she requested a private conversation about summit arrangements." She looked directly at Kael. "I told you about that meeting at the time." Kael was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Or perhaps she had seen it before, in some form, and had refused to understand what it meant. "Kyle," she said. "Where are the letters?" he said. The words were quiet. That was the terrible thing about them. They were not an accusation. They were a request for evidence. But the way he'd framed them, not, "Are the letters real?" but "Where are they?" told her that in his head the question of realness had already been answered. Lady Morwen gestured to one of the unfamiliar servants. The servant came forward with a sealed document case. Kyle took it. He opened it. He read. The banquet hall breathed around him. Celine watched his face and understood, in a way that was so clean and cold it almost didn't feel like understanding at all, that she had already lost this particular fight. Not because the letters were convincing. She hadn't seen them, and she doubted they were anything close to her actual writing, but because the room had filled with the specific kind of waiting that comes before a verdict, not before an investigation, and Kyle was not reading those letters to determine the truth. He was reading them to decide how bad the truth was. The question of whether she'd done it had already been answered by a part of him that lived somewhere underneath his reason. "Kyle," she said again, "think about this. Think about who has motive to place evidence in my chambers. Think about—" "There are soldiers down," said a voice from the entrance to the hall. Everyone turned. A young guard stood in the doorway, stripped of his formal insignia, face gray. "Two soldiers from the Evening Post. They collapsed. The keep physician says they were poisoned." The guard's voice was doing what voices did when the person speaking them was trying very hard not to run. "In the wine stores, the stores that were open tonight for the banquet." The room exploded. Celine felt the moment change, the way you feel a door close. Not violent, just final. The letters had been enough to raise doubt. Poisoned soldiers in a room she'd been responsible for securing as queen of the keep turned doubt into something else entirely. She did not reach for Kyle. She had learned long ago that reaching for him when he'd gone cold produced nothing useful. She stood straight. She kept her hands visible. She looked at him and said, as steadily as she'd said anything in her life, "I did not poison anyone. I did not write those letters. What you are watching happen right now has been built over months, and if you condemn me for it without investigation, you will regret it. Not because of what I'll do, because of what it means about what you're capable of believing." Kyle put the document case down on the table. He looked at her for a long moment, and she held the look, and she thought for just 1 second, 1 second that would cost her more than she could calculate in the dark hours ahead, that she saw something in him that was not certainty, something uncertain. Some old instinct reaching toward her across the public distance of all those watching eyes. Then he looked away. "Confine her," he said. "Kyle, confine her," he said again, louder, and this time it was not to her, it was to the room. Bryn moved. Celine felt her guard step forward instinctively, felt the shift in the air as Bryn put herself between the queen and the nearest two sentinels who were already moving, and Celine said, "Low, fast. Bryn, stand down." Bryn stopped. The two sentinels reached Celine. They were both young. One of them wouldn't look at her. The other looked at her the way people look at something they're not going to forget. "My Lord King," said Lord Heron. He was on his feet, voice carrying, not quite an accusation, but not nothing either. "This is a summit of territorial lords. There is a protocol for—" "Tonight the summit is suspended," Kyle said, "by my authority as Alpha King of the Moonfang territory." He still wasn't looking at Celine. "The queen will be held pending full investigation of the letters and the poisoning." "She hasn't been charged," Heron pressed. "She's being held," Kale said. "That's not the same thing." The sentinel who wouldn't look at her took her arm. She didn't pull away from him. She walked, because the only thing she had left in this hall right now was her own carriage, her own unbroken posture, and she was going to carry those out with her if she carried nothing else. At the doors she stopped. She didn't turn fully, just enough to let her voice reach him. "I've bled for this kingdom," she said, "more than once, more than you know about, because I didn't see the point in listing it. Remember that when you're done being angry and you start thinking clearly again." A beat. "If that happens." Then she let the sentinels walk her out. The underground levels of Moonfang Keep were not built for long occupation. They were built for the short-term confinement of people whose next stop was trial, or worse, and they had the practicality of spaces built for those purposes. Stone, iron, a small barred window set high in the outer wall, that admitted cold air but nothing you could call light. Celine had inspected these cells once, 4 years ago, during a general security review of the keep. She'd noted the drainage problem in the far corner and the inadequate weight distribution on the eastern bars, made recommendations that had been half implemented, and moved on to other problems. She found herself in the second cell from the north end, which she remembered had worse ventilation than the first but was marginally drier. She wondered distantly if the sentinel who'd made the placement decision had known that, or if it was coincidence. The cell door closed. The latch dropped. The two sentinels' footsteps retreated up the stone stairs. Celine stood in the center of the cell for a long moment, not moving. Then she walked the perimeter. 6 paces one way, 4 the other. The eastern bars were still uneven on the middle vertical. She pressed her thumb against the iron and felt the same slight give she'd noted 4 years ago. Not enough to matter. Not now. She sat down on the wooden bench against the far wall and looked at her hands. The hands were steady. She noted this with something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite surprise. She had stopped shaking in difficult moments sometime in her mid-20s, after the second year of marriage had introduced her to a level of sustained difficulty that had either broken that particular nervous habit or taught her to contain it somewhere that didn't show. She sat with the silence and let herself feel, for about 90 seconds, the full weight of what had just happened. He believed it, not just performed belief for the room, believed it. She'd seen it in the second before he'd looked away. Whatever Morwen had been building, whatever picture she'd been constructing day after day, letter by letter, whisper by whisper, it had been built directly into the architecture of Kael's oldest suspicions, the ones he'd carried from before Celine. The ones that said people who stay close to power are there to take it. The ones that said everyone eventually has a price. She had spent 12 years trying to be the exception to that rule. She understood now that she had been trying to disprove something he'd decided was true before he met her, and that was not a fight you could win by being right. You could only win it by never giving him a reason to look for confirmation, and Lady Morwen had given him an enormous reason, and he had looked. The anger came then. She let it. There was a discipline to anger, she'd learned. You had to let it move through you completely, or it would find its own path later, at the wrong moment, through the wrong crack. She had done nothing. Every choice she had made in this keep for 12 years had been in service of the kingdom and in service of a man who had just ordered her confined in front of every territorial lord in the alliance. She had chosen him. She had stayed when it was hard. She had been loyal in ways that had cost her things she was not going to list right now, because listing them would not help her survive the next 12 hours. She let the anger finish moving through her. Then she thought clearly. Morwen had been in her chambers 4 days ago, the false back of the writing cabinet. Celine had never told anyone about that space. She'd discovered it herself 3 years into her tenure, behind a loose panel in the cabinet work, and had used it once, briefly, to store a private document she'd decided later to burn. She had not told Kael about it. She had not told Bryn about it. She had told absolutely no one, which meant that either the letters hadn't actually been found there and Morwen was lying about the location, or Morwen had found the space herself during that private meeting and been either very lucky or very thorough. Given 22 years of patience and the kind of planning that poisoned soldiers and repositioned seating arrangements in the same week, Celine would not bet on luck. The poisoning. She turned this over carefully. 2 soldiers from the wine stores opened for the banquet. The banquet stores were managed through the Queen's domestic authority, which meant that any poisoning from those stores would be laid at Celine's feet by implication regardless of who had actually done it. Morwen had either gotten to the stores directly or gotten to someone who managed them. The new servants, unfamiliar faces behind the carafes, she'd noticed them when she walked in. She needed Bryn. She needed to know what had happened to Bryn after the haul, whether she'd been confined separately, whether she was free and already working on this. She needed to know whether the poisoned soldiers were actually dying or whether the poisoning had been calibrated to incapacitate rather than kill. If it was calibrated, if the intent was to have witnesses rather than casualties, that meant Morwen wanted accusation, not actual death. She wanted the appearance of treachery, not the complication of a murder investigation. And there was something else. Celine closed her eyes and went back through the sequence. Morwen standing up from the table. The servant with the document case. The timing, specifically, between Morwen's declaration and the arrival of the guard with the soldier report. The guard had come from the entrance, not from the soldiers' quarters, which were north of the keep, but from the entrance hall, which was south. Someone had been waiting with that report. Someone had been watching for Morwen to stand and had timed the second blow to land before the first had settled. There were at least two people coordinating this, possibly more. Above her, through the stone floor, she could hear the distant percussion of the banquet hall breaking up. Scraping chairs, voices raised and then forced down, the specific sound of several dozen armed men deciding how alarmed to be. She needed to get out of this cell. Not now. Not tonight. Not with the keep in active alarm, and every sentinel in the building on heightened placement. But she needed to start building toward it, because Morwen had not stopped with the accusation. The accusation was the first move. There would be others, and they would come quickly, because Morwen had not spent 22 years being patient only to give her target time to recover. Celine sat on the wooden bench in the cold cell and thought about all the people in this keep who knew the difference between what she was and what she'd just been accused of being. She sorted them by access, by loyalty, by exposure to risk, by what they stood to lose. She was systematic about it. She was still sorting when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Not a sentinel's heavy tread, something lighter, more careful, with the specific interval of someone trying to be quiet in a space with bad acoustics. She did not stand. She waited. A face appeared at the bars. Young. A servant by the rough-cut uniform, maybe 17, with a jaw that was set too hard for his age and eyes that looked like they'd arrived at a decision they weren't comfortable with. He said nothing for a moment. "You were at the wine station," Celine said. She'd seen him when she came back through the hall, one of the unfamiliar faces, but he'd been watching her more directly than the others. "In the east section." The boy flinched. "Yes, my queen." "How long have you worked in this keep?" 3 weeks. He swallowed. "I was placed here. I didn't know. What they were going to do, I didn't know all of it." Celine looked at him steadily. "But you knew something." He reached through the bars and pressed something against them. A folded piece of paper. His hand was shaking, which either meant he was genuinely frightened or was very good at performing genuine fright, and she needed to account for both possibilities. She took the paper. She didn't unfold it immediately. She kept her eyes on him. "What's your name?" she said. "Edrin." "Who sent you down here, Edrin?" His jaw tightened further. "She didn't send me. She doesn't know I'm here." "Then who?" "My mother works in the keep laundry. She's worked here 8 years. He pressed his lips together. "I didn't come here to help them. I came because my mother said, she said you once got her brother a fair hearing when he was accused of—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter. The paper. You should read what's in it." She unfolded it. Her eyes moved across the words twice before she fully processed them. And when she had processed them, she sat very still for a long moment, feeling something that lived in the territory between dread and clarity. The paper contained 4 words in someone else's handwriting, and a partial name, and a location within the keep that she knew. She looked at Idran. His face had the particular blankness of someone who had read what he was delivering and understood most of it, and was very frightened by what he understood. "Go," she said. "Now. Don't tell anyone you were here. Don't tell anyone what you just gave me. Do you hear me?" He nodded. He went. His footsteps hurried up the stairs and disappeared. Celine looked back down at the paper. It said, "Morwen not alone. Underground passage. They come tonight." And then the partial name, which she recognized, which she had not expected to recognize, which changed almost everything she'd thought she understood about the geometry of this conspiracy. And below the name, the location, the eastern supply tunnels, running beneath the palace foundations. Not the palace she was sitting under, the palace above her, the one that was currently full of territorial lords and their soldiers, and a king who had just made himself the most dangerous kind of vulnerable, the kind that came from believing you'd already solved the threat. They come tonight. Celine's fingers tightened on the paper. Above her, the sounds of the banquet hall's collapse had quieted into something new. Not silence, but the humming alertness of a keep on full sentinel deployment, every guard at station, every door locked. And beneath all of it, if she held her breath and listened to the stone, something else, something that sounded faintly like movement in the walls. The movement in the stone stopped. Celine held her breath and counted to 8. Nothing. Just the deep cold of quarried rock and the distant drip of water somewhere in the lower drainage channel she'd noted in her inspection 4 years ago, and flagged and had half fixed and was now acutely grateful existed, because it meant the underground level had at least one functioning water source if she needed to be here longer than tonight. She was not going to be here longer than tonight. She folded Edrin's paper into a shape small enough to press flat against the inside of her left wrist, under the cuff of her sleeve. Not because hiding it accomplished anything definitive. If they searched her, they'd find it. But because the act of securing it settled something in her hands, gave her fingers a task while her mind worked through the geometry of what she'd just been handed. Morwen not alone. She had known that since the seating arrangements. No single person repositioned 12 lords' placements and planted forged letters and poisoned soldiers and coordinated the timing of a guard report from separate ends of the keep in the same evening without infrastructure, without people, without a network that had been quietly built and maintained for years inside the walls she was currently sitting below. The partial name on the paper was Lord Casson. She'd watched him laugh at Kael's joke at the head table 2 hours ago. She'd watched him lean in, say something, watch Kael's reaction. She'd thought, he's positioned too close for his territorial rank. She'd thought, someone got to the seating master. She hadn't thought, he's one of them. She should have. She ran it back through everything she knew about Casson, Ironback clan, Eastern Mountains. His territory shared a border with 2 of the Vorthen lords named in the forged letters, the lords she'd supposedly been promising favorable terms after the transition. He'd been vocal, privately, about trade levies under the current arrangement. He'd had 3 separate meetings with Morwen in the past 4 months that had been logged in the official visitor records as social calls. She'd seen those logs. She'd noted the frequency as slightly unusual and had meant to look closer and had been occupied with the summit preparations and had not gotten back to it. That was going to be a difficult thing to sit with later. She filed it away for later. The eastern supply tunnels ran the full length of the keep's foundation and then continued past the outer walls into the storage yards, and beyond that, into the hillside depots that predated the current palace by roughly 100 years. She knew this because she'd done the infrastructure review. She knew the tunnel access points, the latch mechanisms, the places where the stonework had been reinforced, and the places where it hadn't. She also knew that the primary tunnel access from inside the keep was through a door in the lower storage level that was currently on the other side of 2 locked iron gates and a sentinel post. They come tonight. She needed to be out of this cell before whatever was coming through those tunnels arrived, because if Morwen's people were moving through the underground passage, it meant the plan had moved past the accusation phase. The accusation had been designed to get Celine out of position, away from Kael, away from the keep's security apparatus, stripped of authority. With the queen confined and the king in the shock of public betrayal, the keep was running on disrupted command. Sentinels at elevated placement, but uncertain of their orders. Lords in their guest quarters behind locked doors or milling in corridors, trying to calculate which way the night was going to fall. It was the perfect moment to move. She stood and went to the cell door. The latch was a standard drop bar from the outside. No internal mechanism, no possibility of manipulation from within. The bars themselves were iron, 3/4 inch, set in dressed stone. The uneven vertical she'd noted 4 years ago was in the middle of the east-facing wall, not the door wall, and the give in it was structural fatigue that would take weeks of consistent pressure to exploit. She did not have weeks. She stepped back and looked at the door frame. The hinges were visible from the inside. Surface mount, not recessed, which was consistent with a cell built for short-term confinement rather than high-security detention. The pins were old. The lower hinge had surface rust visible even in the low light from the corridor. She was considering this when she heard footsteps on the stairs, heavier than Edrin's, more than one person. She moved back to the bench and sat down. 2 sentinels appeared. The one who'd been unable to look at her in the banquet hall was one of them. He still wasn't looking at her directly. The other was older, face like weathered saddle leather, carrying himself with the specific economy of movement that came from genuine experience rather than training. Behind them, walking without hurry, was Bryn. Celine let out one slow breath. Bryn was not confined. Her weapons were gone, both of them, the sword and the boot knife. And she was walking between the 2 sentinels in a way that made it technically ambiguous, whether she was under escort or accompanying them voluntarily. Her face was the face she used when she was furious about something and had decided that showing it would be counterproductive. The older sentinel unlocked the cell door. He held it. He looked at Celine with an expression she couldn't fully read. "The king has authorized a personal guard for the queen during confinement," he said. "Does the king know he authorized that?" Celine asked. The sentinel's expression shifted slightly, not quite a smile. Commander Adric made the arrangement. Celine looked at Bryn. Bryn's expression said, "We can discuss the specifics of how this happened at a more convenient moment." "Thank you," Celine said to the sentinel. "I'll be at the top of the stairs," he said. He looked at Bryn. "Door stays locked." "Understood," Bryn said. They left. The lock dropped. Footsteps retreated. Bryn crossed the cell in 4 strides and stopped 2 feet from Celine, and for a moment neither of them said anything. It was the kind of silence that had 12 years of history in it. "Cassin," Celine said. "He's part of it." Bryn didn't look surprised. "How long have you known?" "About 8 minutes. I've suspected for 6 weeks." Bryn's jaw was set. "I didn't have anything solid enough to bring to you, and you were—" She stopped. "I was hoping I was wrong," Celine said. "Yes." They looked at each other. "What happened after they took me out?" Celine said. The room fractured. Heron tried to push for protocol, formal charge, formal hearing. Cassin shut it down. "Used the poisoning as justification for emergency suspension of summit procedure." Bryn's voice was controlled, clipped, each sentence arriving like something she'd been compressing for the past hour. Morwen requested an immediate meeting with the king, private, his chambers. Did she get it? She was in there for 40 minutes. Celine looked at the floor. "What was Kael's state when you last saw him?" "Contained," Bryn said carefully, "which in my experience is worse than angry." "Yes." Contained meant he'd stopped moving through the first reaction and entered the harder territory of a man who had committed to a position in public and was now armoring the commitment rather than examining it. She knew that state. She'd navigated it before, in smaller crises. In those cases, she'd had access to him. She'd had proximity. She'd been able to do the slow, precise work of opening a small space in the armor where reason could get through. From a cell with a locked door, that option was not available. "The tunnels," she said. Bryn went still. "What about them?" "Someone passed me a message. Eastern supply tunnels. Movement tonight." She watched Bryn's face. "You already knew." Bryn said nothing for 2 full seconds. Then, "Idric intercepted a scout, one of Cassin's men, dressed as a keep servant, 2 hours ago in the lower storage level. The man didn't talk much, but the positioning was enough. Does Adric know about the tunnels specifically?" "He knows something's moving underground. He doesn't know the scope." Bryn's voice dropped. "My queen, Celine. If Morwen is bringing outside fighters in through the tunnels tonight, the keep's defensive posture is set wrong for it. Everything's positioned for internal threat, for the summit lords, for a confrontation in the upper levels, not for a breach from below." "I know. Adrek needs to reposition, and he needs to do it in the next—" Bryn looked up at the narrow window. The darkness outside was the deep blue of late night, past midnight. "Probably the next 2 hours, maybe less." "Then he needs to know," Celine said. "You need to get to him. I was assigned here. If I leave—" "Bryn," Celine's voice was flat. "A dozen lords and their retinues are sleeping in this keep tonight. My husband is in this keep tonight. Whatever is coming through those tunnels will not stop with Morwen taking the throne. You know that." Bryn looked at her for a long moment. The furious control in her face didn't change, but something behind it shifted, the calculation completing. "If I leave this cell," Bryn said, "you'll be alone down here. I'll be locked in a cell with a sentinel at the top of the stairs. I'm not in immediate danger." She paused. "The keep might be. If something comes through before I can get Adric into position, then I'll manage," Celine said. "With what?" "They took everything." Celine looked at the old sentinel's face in her memory, the surface rust on the lower hinge, the uneven vertical bar. "I'll manage," she said again. Bryn held the look for another moment. Then she turned and walked to the cell door and knocked twice on the bars. The older sentinel came back down. He looked at Bryn's face and then at Celine's face, and something in his own face settled into a decision. "I need to speak with Commander Adric," Bryn said. "Now, it's a security matter that outweighs my assignment here." The sentinel looked at Celine. "My queen?" "She has my authorization," Celine said, "for whatever that's worth tonight." Something moved in the man's expression. He looked at Bryn. 10 minutes. I'll walk you to the commander's post." 5 is enough," Bryn said. When they were gone, Celine sat in the silence of the cell and thought about Lord Cassin at the head table, laughing at the king's joke. She thought about 22 years of patience, about the particular kind of ambition that didn't burn, it didn't rage, it didn't demand, it simply waited and gathered and calculated and moved only when the calculation was complete and the timing was exactly right. She had never fully respected it before. She found she respected it now, not because she admired it, but because she understood it the way you understand something that is trying to kill you, with complete attention, without the luxury of contempt. Morwen had needed 3 things in sequence. First, Kael's trust in Celine broken. Second, the Summit Lord's fractured, no unified response that keeps authority in question. Third, an entry point, outside forces, enough strength to finalize whatever came next. The letters and the poisoning had handled the first 2. The tunnels were the third. Celine stood. She went to the eastern wall. She put her thumb against the uneven vertical bar and pressed, feeling the give. Still there. Still consistent with what she remembered. She pressed harder, working the metal in its stone setting, feeling the specific resistance of old iron and aging mortar. This was going to take time she might not have, but doing nothing was its own kind of countdown. She pressed. She worked. She kept her breathing even because there was no point in burning through anything faster than necessary. She was approximately 11 minutes into this when she heard it. Not footsteps. Not movement. Something lower. A vibration in the stone floor beneath her feet. Barely perceptible. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't already listening for it with your whole body. She stopped. She put her hand flat against the eastern wall. There. Under her palm, through 6 inches of quarried rock, a rhythm. Not random, not structural settling. The specific arrhythmic percussion of a group of people moving quickly in a confined space, trying to be quiet and not entirely succeeding. They were already in the tunnels. She moved to the cell door. "Hello," she called up. Her voice was level. She was not going to yell. "I need the sentinel at this post, now." Nothing. She called again, louder. The silence from upstairs had a different quality than it had before. Not the silence of someone ignoring her. The silence of an unoccupied space. The sentinel was gone. She stood at the cell door and processed this. The older sentinel, the one who'd arranged Bryn's entry, who'd looked at her with that unreadable expression, who'd walked Bryn to Adric's post and presumably come back and was now not at the top of the stairs, had either been called away or had left deliberately, or something had happened to him. 3 possibilities, and none of them were good in the same way. She went back to the eastern bar. She pressed both hands against it this time and leaned her full weight into it, working it in a slow circular motion against its mounting. The mortar around the base was old. In a properly maintained cell, it would have been repointed years ago. This cell had been half-maintained, like everything she'd flagged in that inspection, and she was going to have a very direct conversation with whoever had signed off on the budget reduction if she got through the next hour with enough left in her to have conversations. The bar shifted. Not much. A few millimeters in the mounting. She kept working. The vibration in the floor was more consistent now, closer. The bar shifted again. A 1/4 inch of play, maybe. Enough that when she gripped it with both hands and put her shoulder into it, she could feel the differential. The bottom mounting looser than the top. She changed her angle, applied pressure upward and outward simultaneously, using the resistance of the stone as leverage. The bottom of the bar pulled free of the mortar with a sound like a bad tooth coming out of a jaw. Not loud. Loud enough. She froze. Listened. The vibration in the floor had stopped, which was worse than if it had continued, because it meant the people in the tunnel had either arrived at their destination or had heard her and stopped moving. She worked the top of the bar faster now, no longer concerned with silence. The upper mounting was better set, but the iron itself had fatigue cracks she could feel under her palms, the metal cold and grainy with age. and when she angled her leverage point to the base of the crack and pushed with everything she had, the bar separated at the crack point with a sound that was somewhere between a snap and a groan. She had a piece of iron roughly 20 inches long, pointed at the break-in, weighted right. She went to the door. The gap left by the missing bar was not wide enough for her to reach the outer latch. She measured it with her eye. 4 inches short, maybe 5. She put her arm through the adjacent gap between 2 remaining bars and felt for the latch, and found it, and found that her reach was, in fact, 4 inches short. She looked at the hinge, surface mount, rust on the lower pin. She used the pointed end of the iron bar on the lower hinge pin, worked it upward, tapping in controlled strikes. Not the frantic hammering of panic, but the measured, deliberate force of someone who had calculated what the metal needed and was delivering exactly that. The pin moved, 1/8 of an inch, then 1/4. She was on the 3rd hinge pin, the upper one, when the outer door at the top of the stairs opened. She did not stop. She kept working the pin. Footsteps on the stairs. Fast. Not the heavy tread of sentinels. Lighter and wrong. The wrong rhythm, the wrong distribution of weight, the specific cadence of people who'd been moving through underground spaces and had recently started moving above ground. 2 people. Maybe 3. The first one came around the corner of the corridor and stopped when he saw her. He was big, not tall, but wide through the shoulders, with the build of someone who'd spent years swinging something heavier than a sword. He was wearing keep servant clothing that was slightly wrong in the cut, the way clothing looked when it had been prepared for someone rather than worn in. He had a short blade in his right hand. He looked at her through the bars, at the iron bar in her hands, at the hinge pins she'd been working, and then he looked at the second man who'd come around the corner behind him. "She's not broken," the second man said. He had an accent she couldn't immediately place, eastern border, possibly, one of the mountain territories. His voice had the flat quality of someone reporting a fact that was mildly inconvenient rather than alarming. "No," she agreed. "I'm not." The first man looked at the door, at the compromised hinge pins, at the gap where she'd removed the bar. He was calculating. She could see it. Calculating whether the cell was still functional as a cell, whether extracting her through the door was simpler than dealing with the current configuration. "Open it," the second man said. "If I open it?" "She's one woman. Open it." The first man moved to the door latch. Celine shifted her grip on the iron bar. 20 inches of fatigued iron with a breakpoint edge, and she was standing in a 6x4 cell with bad ventilation and nowhere to go, and 3 men between her and the stairs. She thought of Kyle upstairs in his contained state, armoring a decision he'd made in public and not yet looked at clearly. She thought of Bryn running through the upper corridors toward Audrich's post. She thought of the vibration in the floor that had stopped moving at exactly the wrong moment. The latch lifted. The door swung open. The first man stepped through, and Celine stepped into him before he'd finished stepping, driving the pointed end of the bar at the space below his right shoulder where she knew from years of watching soldiers that the armor gap was widest, and the impact was solid enough that he went sideways into the doorframe with a sound that involved air leaving a body faster than it was designed to. The second man was already moving. She pivoted. The corridor was 4 feet wide. That was both the problem and the solution. She put her back to the eastern wall, which meant he couldn't get behind her without going through her, and she had the bar extended, and she said, clearly, in the voice she'd spent 12 years learning to project through rooms full of men who'd rather not listen to her, "Stop." He didn't stop entirely. He slowed. He looked at her the way people looked at a confined animal that was behaving more like a threat than confined animals were supposed to behave. "I don't know what you've been told to do with me," she said. "I don't know what she's paying you or what she's promised you, but I need you to think about something." She held his eyes. "Whatever Morwen told you about tonight, whatever the plan is, ask yourself why she needed to bring you in through a tunnel instead of through the front gate." The third man had come around the corner now. He stopped when he saw the first man in the doorframe and the configuration in the corridor. "Because," Celine continued, "men who come through front gates get paid and sent home. Men who come through tunnels get buried in them." The second man said nothing. "She used you to get into the keep," Celine said. "What she does after she's in the keep, she doesn't need you for. You understand what that means." The silence in the corridor had a specific texture to it. Not the silence before violence. The silence before a man recalculates something quickly and doesn't like what the new numbers say. Above them, from somewhere in the upper levels of the keep, came a sound that was not a voice and not a footstep, and not the background noise of a building settling. It was a door, somewhere on the upper floors, being broken open from the inside, and then carrying down through the stone and the dark and the 4 floors of quarried mountain rock between her and whatever was happening above. The sound of Cale Draven's voice. Not words, just the tone of it. The specific register of a man who had just discovered that what he'd believed was already true had been, in fact, the wrong answer entirely. Celine looked at the second man. He looked at her. The first man was still in the doorframe, not down but compromised, one arm doing something awkward. "Move," Celine said. She stepped forward, bar extended. "Move, or I go through you. Either works for me." The second man looked at the third man. Neither of them had expected her to step forward. She could see it in the recalibration that crossed both faces, the abrupt downward revision of whatever they'd been told about who they were dealing with. She stepped forward again. The third man stepped back. She was 3 feet from the stairs. Above her, Kael's voice again, and this time there were words in it. Not clear, too much stone between them. But the specific fracture in the register, that particular crack in the voice of a man whose contained state had broken open into something raw, told her that whatever had just happened on the upper floor had shattered the armor he'd built around his public decision. He'd found something, been told something, seen something. She needed to get to him before Morwen did. She ran for the stairs. She took the stairs 2 at a time. The iron bar was still in her right hand, and she kept it there not because she'd made a decision about it, but because letting go of it required a thought she didn't have available. Behind her in the corridor, she heard the second man say something to the third man in a tone that was not pursuit. It was the tone of 2 people deciding whether a situation still required them, and concluding provisionally that it did not. She didn't look back. The upper door from the underground level opened into the lower storage corridor, which ran east-west beneath the main keep and connected the supply yards to the inner stores. She came through it moving fast and nearly took down a sentinel who was stationed at the corridor junction with his sword already half drawn, the whites of his eyes visible in the low torchlight. He recognized her before the sword cleared the scabbard. "My queen." "Where is the king?" she said. "Upper floor, his private—" She was already past him. The keep was wrong in a way that was hard to name precisely, but impossible to misread. She felt it in the air, in the quality of the noise. Too much movement on floors that should have been quiet at this hour. Voices carrying in registers that weren't anger yet, but were one bad piece of information away from it. 3 sentinels ran past her in the main corridor heading north, and none of them stopped to question what the confined queen was doing loose in the keep because they were already committed to somewhere else, which told her the disruption upstairs had fractured the sentinel deployment exactly the way she'd predicted it would. She took the eastern staircase. The western staircase was shorter, but it ran past the Lord's guest quarters, and she didn't need witnesses right now, didn't need to become a visible event before she understood what she was walking into. 2nd floor. 3rd. The stone under her feet changed from the rough quarry cut of the lower levels to dressed block, then to the fitted work of the upper keep, where the walls held tapestries between the torch brackets, and the corridors were wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast without contact. She'd learned these corridors in her 2nd week in the keep, pacing them alone at night until the geometry of the building was in her body rather than her head. She knew where every door sat in relation to every other door. She knew which floorboards ran loud and which ran quiet. She knew, specifically, that the private corridor outside Kael's chambers had a long approach with no cover, and that anyone coming down it could be seen from the chamber entrance 30 feet before they arrived. She slowed at the top of the eastern stair. The corridor was not empty. Kael was in it. He was standing 10 feet from his chamber door with his back to her, facing Lord Casson, who was facing him, and between them on the floor was a body, not dead. Moving. Barely. The movement of someone who was conscious and trying not to show how badly they were hurt. A guard, from the uniform. Young. The same guard she registered with a lurch of specific recognition, who had delivered the soldier report to the banquet hall 2 hours ago. The one who'd been standing in the doorway with a gray face and a voice doing its best not to run. He was on the floor outside Kael's chamber with a wound in his side that was producing a quantity of blood inconsistent with a minor altercation. She stopped moving. Kael had not heard her. He was looking at Cassin with the expression she'd described to herself earlier as contained, but contained was no longer the right word. Contained meant compressed. What was on Kael's face right now was the aftermath of compression that had already failed. The specific look of a man who had been moving through a managed anger and had arrived, without warning or preparation, at the thing underneath the anger, which was something rawer and harder to name and considerably more dangerous. "He was carrying it to me," Kael said. His voice was flat and factual in the way that was not calm. "He was bringing it to my chambers. Your man put a blade in him before he got through the door." "My lord king," Cassin said, "the boy was moving without authorization at an unusual hour, and my guard acted on—" "Your guard," Kael said. "Your guard. You brought personal guards into my keep for a summit that has no provision for territorial retinues above 4 men per lord. You have 11. He took one step toward Cassin. "I counted them at the gate yesterday, and I let it pass because you gave me a reason that I accepted, and I should not have accepted it." Cassin's face was doing careful work. It was the face of a man managing a situation that had not deteriorated past recoverable, not yet, and who was committed to keeping it in that territory through sheer management. "My lord, the boy—" "What was he carrying?" Silence. "What was he carrying to me, Cassin?" More silence. The specific texture of a silence that contained an answer the person holding it had not yet decided whether to give. Celine moved. She came down the corridor, not quietly. She let her footsteps sound, let them have their own announcement. And both men turned. Kael's face when he saw her went through 3 things in approximately 1 second. The first was something that might have been relief if it hadn't been immediately overwritten by the second, which was the reemergence of the public position he'd taken in the banquet hall. The third was something that canceled both of those and sat underneath them, something that she had no word for, and that she suspected he didn't either. "You're out of the cell," he said. "Yes." "How?" "The maintenance on the eastern bars was inadequate." She held his eyes. "I flagged it 4 years ago." Something moved in his face. Not humor. Too much weight in the room for humor. But the specific recognition of a person who has been consistent in ways that have not always been convenient and who has just proved it again. She looked at the wounded guard on the floor. She crouched beside him, put 2 fingers on the side of his neck, assessed the wound with her eyes. Deep, but not into the cavity. He needed pressure and a physician and time. "Get him to the medical rooms," she said to the corridor in general. Then she stood and looked at Cassin. "What was he carrying?" Cassin looked at Kael. "Answer her," Kael said. The management on Cassin's face slipped. Just slightly. A millimeter of give in the jaw, a tightening around the eyes that happened when a calculation completed, and the result was not good. "I don't know what you're suggesting," Cassin said. "You know exactly what I'm suggesting." Celine took 3 steps toward him. She still had the iron bar in her hand and she hadn't decided about it, and apparently she was still not going to decide about it because she left it where it was. The boy saw something, or heard something, or was given something by someone trying to get information to the king, and your guard put a blade in him before it arrived. She stopped 6 feet from Cassin. "Which means whatever he was carrying would have been a problem for you." "My queen," Cassin said, with the practiced inflection of a man deploying the title as a slight rather than an address, "you are an accused woman who has broken out of confinement. I don't think—" "Find it," Celine said to Kael. She didn't look away from Cassin. "Whatever the boy was bringing, it's either on him still, or it's in the corridor between here and wherever he came from. Find it." Kael was already moving. He went to the wounded guard, crouched the way she had, and she watched his hands move through the search with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. Not a king conducting a search, but a man who had learned, at some point in his life before the crown, what a thorough search felt like. He found it in the guard's boot. A folded document, dark at one edge with the guard's blood, but intact. He stood. He opened it. The corridor was completely silent except for the faint sound of the wounded guard's breathing. And somewhere below them, a door closing in a way that echoed up through the stone. Celine watched Kael read. She had spent 12 years reading his face in moments of information. She knew the face he made when something confirmed what he already suspected. She knew the face he made when something genuinely surprised him. She knew the specific, terrible face he made when something surprised him and also humiliated him, when the surprise contained within it the evidence of his own prior failure of perception. That was the face he was making now. He read for longer than the document should have taken. She understood why. He was reading it multiple times, running it against everything he thought he knew, finding the places where it fitted and the places where it required him to revise. When he looked up, he looked at Casson. Casson had stopped managing his face. There was no point anymore, and whatever else he was experienced enough to know when a thing was past the point of management. 22 years, Kyle said. The words came out with no ornamentation, flat, precise, with the weight of a man who is not performing and is not containing anything anymore. You have been in this alliance for 22 years. Casson said nothing. The Vorthen Lords, the Greyclaw access routes, the forged letters. Kale's voice stayed flat, but something in it was tearing, not the surface of it, but the structure underneath. You provided the eastern border access. You provided the forgery materials. You are the one who got to my seating master. He looked at the paper again. You have been Morwen's ground in this keep for how long? You want an honest answer? Casson said. I want. Kale stopped. He breathed. Yes. Give me an honest answer. For once in the 22 years I've had you at my table, give me a sentence that's true. Casson looked at him with an expression that was not quite contempt and not quite pity. The expression of a man who had spent so long inside a different version of events that the genuine version had lost its claim on him. 11 years, Casson said. The number landed in the corridor like a stone dropping into still water. Celine felt the ripple of it move through the air. 11 years, a year after she'd arrived in the keep. She ran it backward, mapped it against what she knew, and found the date. The summit after the border dispute, when Morwen had hosted 3 territorial lords at her estate for a week, and it had been logged as a social gathering, and Casson had attended, and nobody had looked at the attendance list closely enough because why would they? Kale's expression had gone somewhere she'd never seen it go before, past anger, past humiliation, into the blank white territory of a man discovering that the ground he'd been standing on was not the ground he'd thought, and that this had been true for a very long time, and that he had not known. That was the hardest part of betrayal at that scale, not the act of it, the duration, the retroactive reframing of every room, every meal, every decision made with the wrong information. 11 years of council meetings, 11 years of border agreements and trade discussions and strategic summaries, all of them potentially contaminated, all of them now requiring re-examination with a kind of thoroughness that was genuinely staggering. Celine had thought she knew what Kael's face looked like when it broke open. She was learning now that she'd only seen the surface breaks. This was structural. Take him, Kael said. His voice had dropped to something barely above a murmur. 2 of his personal guards materialized from the end of the corridor. They'd been at the far post, within earshot, but out of the immediate sightline, and they moved now with the controlled speed of men who'd been listening and were ready. Casson did not resist. He looked at Celine as they took his arms, and the look he gave her had something strange in it. Not defeat, not anger, but something almost resembling assessment. The look of a player who has lost a round but has not yet determined whether the game is finished. Lady Morwen is not alone in this, he said. To her, not to Kyle. You know that. You've always been better at reading rooms than he has. Where are her people right now? Celine said. Casson smiled. It was not a warm smile. Moving. The guards took him down the corridor. Kael stood in the silence they left behind with the bloodied document in his hand, and Celine stood 6 feet from him, and the distance between them had the specific quality of a space that contained 12 years of history and a very recent catastrophic failure of judgment, and neither of them had the resources right now to address that directly, because there were more immediate catastrophes in progress. She waited. He turned. He looked at her. He opened his mouth. Not now, she said. Whatever you're about to say, not now. He closed his mouth, opened it again. Celine, Morwen is moving her people, right now. The tunnels beneath the east wing are the access point. Bryn went to Adric, but we don't know if she got there in time or if Adric has repositioned. She held his eyes. I need you functional. Whatever else is happening between us, I need you functional right now, and you need to let the other thing wait 20 minutes. He looked at her for a long moment. The rawness on his face didn't go away. He didn't try to manage it or contain it or compress it back into something more presentable. He just let it be there, which was perhaps the most honest thing she'd seen him do in a very long time. 20 minutes, he said. Yes. And then we talk, she said, about all of it. He nodded, one short, hard movement. They moved. She briefed him in the corridor as they went. The tunnels, the timing, the fact that the sentinel post below had been vacated. The two men she'd left in the underground level who had not pursued and whose current status and intentions were unknown. She spoke in the compressed factual register she used in genuine emergencies, no ornamentation, and he received it the same way, asking two questions that were both precise and both about things she hadn't addressed yet, which told her that whatever else had broken open tonight, his operational mind was still intact. They came down the western stair and took the main corridor toward the keep's center, and it was there, at the junction of the north and south passages, that they found Bryn. She was standing with Commander Audric and 4 of his men, and the expression on her face when she saw Celine had 3 distinct layers: relief, fury that it had been close enough to require relief, and the particular look of someone who has just delivered extremely bad news to a person who is not yet aware they've received it. Celine stopped. What? Bryn looked at Audric. We repositioned, Audric said. He was a big man, built like a mill, with a gray-shot beard and the kind of economy of movement that came from decades of genuine field command. His voice had a quality right now that she associated with men delivering damage reports. We covered the primary tunnel access point, eastern supply door, lower level. He paused. They didn't come through the eastern tunnel. The silence that followed that sentence had a specific shape. Where did they come through? Kyle said. The well shaft, Audric said, in the inner yard. It connects to an older channel system that predates the current foundations by roughly I know the well shaft, Celine said. She said it quietly. Her own voice sounded strange to her, too flat, too precise. The voice she used when she was processing something that required the flat precision because the alternative was something less useful. It was flagged for decommissioning in the infrastructure review. It was never decommissioned because the budget allocation was... She stopped. She had flagged it. She had flagged it, and it had not been fixed, and she had not followed up on it, had not escalated it, had not treated it as the security vulnerability. It was, because it had been one of 47 items on a maintenance list, and she'd been occupied with the summit, and before that the Eastern trade renegotiation, and before that the winter supply crisis, and she had not gone back to item 31 on the list. She felt the weight of that in a way that was specific and physical. Not guilt, exactly, but its harder cousin, the recognition of a consequential failure that was genuinely her own. How many came through? She said. We don't know yet, Audric said. They were already inside before we had eyes on the shaft. We've sealed it now, but... Show me, Kyle said. Audric moved. They followed. The inner yard was a courtyard space enclosed on all 4 sides by the keep's central structure, open to the sky, used for equipment storage and the kind of maintenance work that needed outdoor space but not exterior exposure. At night it was lit by 4 wall torches and nothing else, and the well shaft sat in the yard's northwest corner, its stone cap sitting 3 feet from the wall. The cap had been moved. It was sitting at an angle, heavy stone displaced by either tools or bodies pressing upward from below, and around the shaft's opening the flagstones were marked with the specific irregular pattern of wet boot prints heading north, toward the inner keep's private residential levels. Kyle looked at the prints. He looked at the direction they ran. He looked at Celine. She was already counting. The prints were overlapping, difficult to read with precision, but the spread of them and the distribution of weight suggested more than 5 people. Possibly as many as 8. 8 people, inside the keep, heading toward the residential levels, with, given the level of planning that had gone into everything else tonight, a specific destination and a specific purpose, and a timeline that was not in her favor. The residential level, she said. Morwen's guest chambers are on the 3rd floor north. She's not in them. She looked at Kyle. But the Lord's chambers are. The summit lords. Asleep or awake, behind locked doors in the north residential corridor, each of them representing a territorial alliance that had a vote in what happened to this throne if the king died without a clear successor. Not assassination. Control. Take the lords, take the witness pool, control the narrative of what happened tonight and who had done what to whom, and whether the queen's release from confinement had been authorized or a breakout, and whether the king's revocation of the accusation had been genuine or coerced. It was not enough to have evidence against Morwen if the people who mattered had watched events from captivity and been told a different version. Celine was already moving toward the north entrance. "Celine," Kael said. She turned. He was 4 feet behind her, and his face in the torchlight had the rawness still in it. But under the rawness was something that had resolved into clarity. The specific clarity of a man who had finished processing the extent of his error and was now choosing what to do in its aftermath. "I was wrong," he said. The words were direct. No ornamentation, no platform, no audience, no carefully constructed public framing. Just the 3 words, in the yard, between the 2 of them. She looked at him. "I know. I need to say it." "You said it." She held his eyes. "Now come help me fix it." She turned and walked through the north entrance into the keep. Behind her she heard his footsteps following, then Bryn's, then Audric's men. The north residential corridor was 2 floors above them, and from somewhere up in the stone she could already hear it. Not screams, not combat, not the sound she'd been braced for, but something quieter and more alarming. The specific silence of a floor that should have sounds on it and didn't. She took the stairs at a run. She came through the 2nd floor landing and around the turn toward the 3rd and pulled up short because the corridor in front of her was not empty. Lady Morwen was standing in it. She was 12 feet away between Celine and the Lord's chambers, dressed in the wine red she'd worn to the banquet, and she was not running and she was not armed with anything visible, and she was not, in any way, behaving like a woman whose plan had just fractured. She was standing as if she'd been waiting. On either side of her, barely visible in the corridor's shadow, were 2 figures. Not fighters, from their build. Servants, or something dressed as servants, holding something that Celine could not immediately identify in the low light. Kael came up the stairs behind her. She heard him stop when he saw. Morwen looked at Celine, then at Kael. The expression on her face was the flattest thing Celine had ever seen on a living person. Not triumph, not desperation, not even the residual satisfaction of a plan well executed. Just the total stillness of someone who had decided, at some point between the banquet hall and this corridor, that the version of events she'd been working toward was no longer the version that mattered, and that whatever came next was simply the next calculation. "You found Cassin," Morwen said. "Yes," Celine said. "I expected you would." She tilted her head slightly. "You're better at this than I planned for. I planned for the Queen. I didn't fully plan for you." "Those aren't the same thing," Celine said. "No," Morwen said. "I understand that now." The corridor was very quiet. Audric's men were behind Kael on the stairs. She could hear the soft contact of boot leather on stone. But the corridor itself was the narrow kind that reduced tactical advantage to whoever was already standing in it, which was currently Morwen and her 2 figures. "The lords," Celine said. "Are they harmed?" "No." Flat, factual. Contained. "They're not harmed." "Let them out." Morwen looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked past her at Kael, and the look she gave him was something Celine couldn't fully read. Too complex, layered with something that might have been grief if grief could exist in a person who'd replaced it entirely with methodology. "You were always going to be him," Morwen said to Kael. Not cruelly, almost with something like resignation. "Your father was weak in one direction. You are weak in a different direction. The throne has never been held by someone who understood what it actually required." "And you do," Kael said. "I did," Morwen said. Past tense, apparently. She looked back at Celine. The assessment in her eyes was the same look Cassin had given her in the corridor. Evaluating, precise, the look of someone filing information for a future use that may or may not arrive. "You'll want to check the document room on the 2nd floor," Morwen said. "There is a set of records there that Cassin kept separate from the main archive. 11 years of records. You'll want them before anyone else finds them." Celine went still. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because it ends cleaner," Morwen said. "And because She paused for the first time in the conversation, a genuine pause, a crack in the flatness that lasted one beat and then closed. Because you didn't break in the cell. I had you put in a cell that was maintained at exactly the right level of inadequacy, and you didn't break, and you didn't wait to be rescued. She paused again. I have been in this keep for 22 years. I know its inventory very thoroughly. I wanted to see what you would do. The air in the corridor was cold and close and smelled of stone and torch smoke, and Celine stood in it and understood that she was looking at a woman who had spent 22 years building toward a goal and had arrived at its failure and was not broken by it, was not even in any way she could identify, particularly surprised. Which meant the thing on the floor of this corridor was not the end of something. It was a pause, and Morwen wanted her to know that. Celine looked at the two figures flanking her. She looked at the iron bar still in her own right hand. She looked at the closed doors of the Lord's chambers behind Morwen and the specific angle of Morwen's body in the corridor. She looked at Kael over her shoulder. His face had gone back to the flat operational clarity from the yard. He gave her nothing visible, which meant he was waiting for her read. She looked at Morwen. "Stand aside," Celine said. A beat. Something moved in Morwen's face. Not compliance, something that preceded compliance, the specific shift of a person who has decided that a battle is not worth the cost of the ground. Morwen stepped to the left. Celine walked forward. She passed within 3 feet of the woman who had dismantled her life in a single evening, who had placed her in a cell and put forged letters in her name and poisoned soldiers at her feast and moved fighters through the foundations of her keep. And she did not look at her as she passed, because looking at her would have required something she didn't have to spare right now, would have required her to bring the full weight of what this night had cost her into a corridor where she still had work to do, and she was not going to let that cost land until she had finished the work. Behind her, she heard Kael stop. She heard him say quietly, to Morwen, "You'll be held. Full hearing. Every lord in this territory will know what you built here." Morwen said nothing. Celine reached the First Lord's chamber door and put her hand on the latch. Inside she could hear voices. Lord Heron's among them, identifiable even through the door, the voice of a man who had been confined against his will and had spent the time analyzing rather than panicking. She opened the door. Heron looked up. Behind him, 2 other lords, both disheveled, both with the expressions of men who had been constructing narratives in their heads for the past hour and were now presented with the primary source and had to revise everything immediately. "My queen," Heron said. Then, looking past her to where Kael had come up the corridor. "My Lord King." Celine looked at the room. 5 lords in one chamber. They'd been consolidated, which meant Morwen had wanted them together, controllable as a group, which also meant she'd left them together long enough that they'd had the conversation they'd needed to have. She looked at Heron's face. He'd been watching. He'd been remembering what she'd told him. Watch Morwen's eyes when it starts. "What did you see?" she said. Heron looked at her for a moment, then at Kael, then back at her. "Everything," he said. "We saw everything." And from below them, sudden and total as a door slamming across the whole building, the keep's bells began to ring. Not the measured toll of an announcement, the fast, overlapping, continuous ring of the emergency signal, the one that meant breach, fire, or both. Celine turned toward the window at the corridor's end, through the glass, orange. The south wing of the keep was burning. The orange through the corridor window was not the soft orange of a torch or a controlled hearth. It was the moving, climbing orange of a fire that had already made its first decisions and was now making its second ones, spreading along whatever it had been given to work with, finding the old timber framing behind the south wing's dressed stone and discovering that 11-year-old maintenance budgets had left it very dry. Celine did not stand at the window. She turned back to the corridor. "Heron, get the lords down the western stair, not the eastern. The eastern opens to the lower storage level, and we don't know who's still down there. Western stair to the outer yard. Move now." Heron moved. He was already in the doorframe, already speaking to the lords behind him with the compressed efficiency of a man who had been waiting to be useful and was grateful for the instruction. Kael was at her shoulder. "Adrek." "I heard it," Adrek said from behind them both. He was already speaking to his men in the shorthand of a commander who had rehearsed this, who had run the keep's fire response in his head before tonight, the way good commanders ran every disaster in their heads before it happened. North and west post to the south wing, seal the residential corridor, get the water lines running from the inner yard cistern. The cistern had a flow reduction, Celine said without turning around. Flagged 14 months ago. Actual output is roughly 60% of rated capacity. A beat. Audric absorbed this. We work with 60%, he said. Yes, she said. You do. She was already walking. The corridor to the south wing ran through the keep's center hall and then turned, and the smoke was reaching the turn already. Not thick, not yet, but with the specific quality of early fire smoke that coated the back of the throat and told you the fire was moving faster than it appeared from this distance. She could feel the temperature differential from 15 feet away. The stone was conducting heat from the south wing's direction. Kael came with her. She didn't tell him not to. She didn't have the standing to tell him anything right now, and she knew it. She was an escaped prisoner whose charges hadn't been formally revoked, operating in a keep that was burning, beside a king who had spent 3 hours believing she was a traitor and had spent the last 40 minutes discovering the full geometry of how wrong that had been. The authority she was exercising right now was the authority of someone who understood the situation better than anyone else present, and the only thing she was going to do with it was burn it completely in the next hour, because there was not going to be a keep or a kingdom left to argue about if the south wing took the whole structure down. Morwen, Kael said, as they moved, she's loose in the keep. Audric's men have her. If they don't, then they don't. We deal with that after we deal with this. The center hall was filling with smoke. 2 servants were running through it in the wrong direction, toward the south wing, not away. And Celine grabbed the first one by the arm and turned her bodily and said, "Out! Western yard! Now!" And the woman ran the right direction, and the second one followed without being told. The doors to the south wing were ahead. Iron-banded oak, closed and visible at their base, was the orange line of firelight. Not smoke bleeding under. Light. The fire was at the doors. Kael put his hand on the iron handle and pulled. The door was hot, but not scalding. Not yet. And it came open, and the heat hit them both like a physical thing. A wall of it, dry and absolute. The kind of heat that had its own weight. The south wing corridor was on fire along its eastern wall. Not the whole wall. A section, roughly 30 feet, centered on what had been the decorative tapestry mounting that ran from floor to ceiling and had provided an extremely efficient fuel pathway from whatever had started at floor level up to the timber framing above. The ceiling above the section was already involved. Burning debris had fallen to the corridor floor and started secondary ignition points in the rug runner that stretched the corridor's length. Standing in the corridor, backing away from the fire with a short blade in one hand and an expression that managed to combine controlled fury with the particular awareness of someone who has been outmaneuvered and is deciding whether to accept it or not, was a man Celine had never seen before. He was big. Not Audric big, not mill-built, but lean and long and the kind of big that moved fast. He was wearing the same wrong-cut servant clothing as the men from the underground level. He was backing away from the fire because the fire had cut him off from whatever he'd been trying to reach. She looked past him and saw the document room door at the far end of the corridor, the one Morwen had told her about. The records room. 11 years of Cassin's records. He wasn't trying to destroy the building. He was trying to destroy the evidence. The fire was his cover, not his goal. Someone had started it specifically here, specifically in this corridor, to burn that room. She moved forward. Into the heat, into the smoke that was thickening fast now that the door was open, toward the man with the blade who had not yet decided about her, and whose eyes were doing the calculation that eyes did when they were measuring what they were looking at against what they'd been prepared for. "The room at the end," she said without breaking stride. "You're not getting to it." He came at her. She'd had the iron bar in her hand for the better part of an hour, and she'd used it once and she used it again now. In the burning corridor, with the heat pressing against the side of her face and the smoke stinging her eyes down to tears that were functional rather than emotional. And the fight was nothing like it was in stories. There was no grace in it. There was no choreography. There was her and a man in a corridor and 20 inches of iron, and the specific, ugly, close-quarters work of 2 people trying to end the other person's ability to continue. He was better with a blade than she was with the bar. She knew this immediately, knew it from the way he moved, the economy, the absence of wasted motion. She was not going to beat him on those terms. She didn't try to. She went inside his reach and took the cut across her left forearm, felt it as a line of cold that hadn't decided yet whether to be pain, and she used the loss of distance to make the blade irrelevant and the iron bar relevant instead. And she went for the knee, hard, because a man who can't stand can't follow her to the document room. He went down on one leg. He didn't drop the blade. He swiped at her from the floor with enough remaining precision that she had to back out of range, and she felt the fire's heat against her left side as she moved and understood she was closer to it than was going to be sustainable for much longer. Kael hit him from the right. Not with a blade. He'd come through the door without a weapon, which, in retrospect, she was going to think about later, how he'd come into a burning building without picking up anything from Audric's men on the way. He hit him with the door brace that he'd pulled from the iron-banded oak behind them, a length of solid hardwood, and the hit was the hit of a man who had 12 years of a kingdom's weight behind his arms and was no longer managing anything. The man went down and stayed down. Kael stood over him, breathing hard. His hands on the wood were white at the knuckles. He looked at Celine's left forearm. "Move," she said. They ran the corridor. The fire was at their left now, close enough that the heat was a physical pressure, close enough that the air they were breathing was not quite what air was supposed to be. The document room door was ahead, and it was closed, and there was no light under it, which meant the fire hadn't reached it yet, and she hit it with her shoulder, and it opened. The room was dark and smoke-hazed and smelled of years of accumulated paper and leather binding and the specific dry dust of records nobody had looked at recently. Shelving along all four walls, a central table, stacked document cases, some sealed, some not. "We can't carry all of it," Kael said behind her. "We don't need all of it." She moved to the shelves. Cassin's records, Morwen had said separate from the main archive. She looked for the organizational logic. Everything in this room would have been arranged by someone, even Cassin's separate material, because people who kept records for 11 years kept them with some kind of system. She looked for what didn't match the Keep's standard organization. There. Bottom shelf, eastern wall. 6 cases, bound in a different leather than the standard Keep archive. No official seal, no date marker visible on the facing. She grabbed 3. Kael grabbed the other 3. "Go," she said. They came back out into the corridor, and the fire had moved in the 40 seconds they'd been in the room. The section she'd passed through was larger now, and the ceiling above it was fully involved, and the corridor was full of a smoke density that reduced visibility to 10 feet and made breathing a considered activity rather than an automatic one. She looked at the path back. The burning section was blocking direct return. She looked at the far end of the corridor. A servant's access door that she knew from the infrastructure survey opened to the external stair on the Keep's south face. "South door," she said. Kael was already coughing. The smoke was the kind that worked fast, the dry paper smoke from a records wing, and it was thickening. She could feel her lungs making decisions about what was worth processing and what wasn't. They ran. She hit the south door with her shoulder, and it opened into the cold external air of the stair, and they came out onto the stone landing, and she breathed, once, with the totality of someone who had been doing without for long enough to understand what it was worth. Below them, in the outer yard, she could see Audric's water lines in motion. The cistern was running at 60%, and the men were working it, voices carrying up in the clipped commands of organized suppression, and the south wing fire was contained to its section, not spreading to the main structure. Not yet. Possibly not going to. Celine stood on the external stair with the smoke behind her and the cold in front of her, and 3 of Cassin's document cases under her left arm, which was bleeding through the sleeve at a rate that was notable but not urgent, and she breathed. Kael was beside her, his own arms full of cases, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Below them the yard was organized chaos, all directed energy, Audric's voice moving through it like the backbone of the whole operation. "The cut," Kael said. "It's fine. It's bleeding through your sleeve." "It's fine," she said again. "I've had worse, and so have you, and right now it's fine." He looked at her arm, and then at her face, and the rawness from the corridor was still there. It hadn't gone anywhere. There'd been no space for it to go. It had just been running underneath everything else for the past 30 minutes, present and unaddressed. He was going to have to carry it a while longer. They both were. She looked at the cases under her arm. 11 years. Whatever was in these pages, Whatever Casson had recorded about meetings and transactions and border arrangements and payments and the specific mechanics of a long conspiracy running inside a functioning kingdom, it was the kind of evidence that didn't leave room for interpretation. Morwen had known about these records. She'd told Celine where to find them, which had seemed in the corridor like an act of strange honesty. It wasn't honesty, it was calculation. Morwen had known the fire was coming. She'd known it was coming for the records specifically. She'd told Celine about the records and told her where to find them, knowing that Celine would go for them, knowing that going for them meant going into the burning corridor. She'd used Celine's competence against her, pointed her at the things she needed to preserve, and let the fire be the mechanism. If the records had burned, the evidence chain broke. If Celine had burned reaching for them, the problem resolved differently. Either outcome was acceptable to Morwen. That was the specific coldness of it. Celine filed this. Let it sit in the part of her mind where things sat until they were needed. We need to get back inside, she said. They came back through the external stairs' lower entry into the keep's south passage, which was clear of smoke at this level, and moved toward the center. Udrek met them at the center hall junction with two of his men and the specific expression of someone who has been managing multiple simultaneous situations and is now about to report on all of them. Fire is contained, he said. Won't reach the main structure. South wing's going to need work, but the building stands. He looked at the cases. You got the records. We got them, Kael said. Morwen? Celine said. Audrek's expression shifted. That's the situation. Tell me the situation. She was in the north corridor. My men had her. He paused. She had a third person with her. Not the ones from the well shaft, someone who'd been in the keep already, in position before tonight. He took out both my men. They're alive, they'll recover. And they moved. Where? Throne room, Audrek said. We have confirmed sighting. She went to the throne room and she's barricaded it from the inside. She has 3 people with her and she has... He stopped, and the stop had a specific quality, the quality of a man who has been a soldier long enough to know when information is going to change the room. She has Bryn. The center hall went very quiet in Celine's perception. Not literally. The yard outside was still running noise through the walls, the water lines and the commands and the controlled chaos of fire suppression. But in the space between what she heard and what she processed, there was a silence that had teeth in it. Bryn had gone to Udrek. Bryn had gotten her the Sentinel, had gotten her back into the keep's operations, had run through these corridors for an hour as Celine's extension in the places Selene couldn't be. Bryn had 11 years of service and a set of forearms like ship rope and the habit of reading tension before the person feeling it had finished feeling it. Morwen had Bryn. She's asking for you, Audrek said. He was looking at Kael. Me, Kael said. Both of you, Audrek said. He looked at Celine. Specifically, both of you. Together. Unarmed. In the throne room. He let that land. She says if the terms aren't met in 20 minutes, she starts with the guard. Celine looked at the iron bar in her right hand. She looked at the document cases under her left arm. She looked at the cut across her forearm and the blood that had made it to her wrist and was sitting there, dark and specific. She thought about Bryn's face when she'd said, "Stand down in the banquet hall." The way Bryn had stopped, the absolute trust in that stopping, the willingness to stand down in a situation where every instinct in her body was screaming otherwise, because Celine had said it and Bryn had chosen 11 years ago to make that trust the load-bearing thing. She handed the document cases to Audrek. She looked at Kael. She wants a meeting, Celine said, in the room that's meant to establish who holds authority in this territory. She knows we know she's trapped. This isn't an escape plan. She held his eyes. This is her final position. She's choosing the ground. She has a hostage, Kael said. She has 1 hostage and 3 people in a barricaded door, and outside that door she has a king who now has Casson's 11-year records, and 5 lords who watched everything tonight from a confined room, and a commander with a full sentinel deployment. She looked at the throne room's direction. She knows what she has. She's choosing the ground because the ground is the only thing she has left to choose. Kael looked at the door at the end of the center hall. The one that opened to the passage leading to the throne room. The one that was 40 feet away and barricaded on the other side with Morwen and 3 armed people in Bryn. He looked at Celine's arm. You need that wrapped before after, she said. Celine, after, she said again. Kael. She waited until he looked at her face instead of her arm. Are you with me? It was not a simple question. It was not asking about the next 20 minutes. It was asking about the 12 years and the banquet hall and the cell and the corridor and all the things that had been said and unsaid in all of that. And it was asking it now, directly, in the center hall of a partly burning keep, with smoke still on both of them, and Audric standing 6 feet away pretending to study the middle distance. Kael looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. It came out quiet. It came out like something he'd decided from somewhere below where decisions usually lived. I'm with you. She nodded once. They walked toward the throne room door. Audric fell into position behind them with 4 men, and the formation they made in the corridor was not ceremonial. It was the formation of people who had been in enough difficult rooms to know that you didn't approach a barricaded position with optimism. You approached it with preparation, and that the difference between those two things was sometimes the difference between walking out and not. The throne room doors were iron-banded oak, like the south wing doors, and they were closed. And behind them was the silence that came from people on the other side who were listening for exactly what was coming. Celine put her hand on the iron handle. The metal was cold. The keep's cold, stone-quarried and mountain-deep, the same cold she'd felt in the cell, the same cold she'd felt every winter morning she'd spent in this building for 12 years. She knew this cold. She'd chosen to stay in it. She looked at Kael beside her. His jaw was set. His eyes were forward. The rawness from earlier was still there, running underneath, and she thought, for just one unguarded second, that it looked almost like the face of a man who understood, finally and completely, what he had nearly thrown away, and who was not yet certain he hadn't already. She pulled the door open. The throne room opened in front of them, high ceiling, long, the 2 rows of columns running to the dais at the far end and the throne on the dais, and the torches in their wall brackets, and in the space between the columns and the dais, catching the torchlight. Lady Morwen stood with 3 armed figures, and Bryn on her knees in the center of the room with a blade at her throat. Morwen looked at the 2 of them in the open doorway. Close the door behind you, she said. Celine stepped through. Kael stepped through beside her. The door closed. The throne room smelled like the keep always smelled at this hour. Cold stone, torch oil, the faint residue of the day's business worked into the walls over decades of accumulated governance. Celine had stood in this room 100 times. She had stood in it for ceremonies and hearings and the specific performative occasions that a throne required as its backdrop. She had stood in it and understood each time that the room was not the power. The room was the story that power told about itself. Tonight the story had come apart. She walked forward. Kael walked beside her. The distance between them and Morwen was 30 feet, and it closed at the pace of 2 people who had decided, somewhere behind the throne room door, that running or hesitating were both forms of surrender, and they had not come this far to surrender. Bryn was on her knees in the center of the room with the blade at her throat and her hands behind her back. And her face, when she saw Celine, did the thing it did when Bryn was furious at a situation and had decided that showing it would be counterproductive. Her eyes were tracking everything. She was not broken. She was waiting. Celine looked at Morwen. The blade comes down, Celine said. When I'm ready, Morwen said. Now. Morwen studied her. The flatness from the corridor was still there, but underneath it, visible now in the way things became visible when the management of them finally cost too much, was something that Celine had not expected to find in this woman's face. Exhaustion, not physical. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something enormous for a very long time and has arrived, finally, at the moment when the carrying ends, and finds that the end of it is not what they thought it would feel like. 22 years. Celine turned that number over again. She had spent 12 years in this keep learning its rooms and its people and its specific weight. Morwen had spent 22 years before her, watching a throne she believed should have been managed differently, watching a king she believed was inadequate, watching the slow drift of a kingdom toward what she assessed as preventable weakness. That didn't make her right. It didn't make what she'd built and used and aimed at Celine anything other than what it was. But Celine was capable, standing in this room with a cut on her arm and smoke in her hair, of holding both things at the same time, the full wrongness of it and the comprehensible human engine that had driven it. Understanding a thing was not forgiving it, but it was the necessary precondition for finishing it cleanly. "What do you want?" Kyle said. His voice was not the king's voice. It was the voice from the outer yard, stripped of the performance layer, direct. Morwen looked at him. The exhaustion shifted in her face, and under it was something older, something that might have been, in a different version of events, in a different lifetime, grief. "I wanted the throne protected," she said. "That's what I've always wanted. From the day your father died and you took it at 31 and didn't know what you had." She paused. "You have never known what you had. So you tried to take it from me. I tried to replace you with something that would last." She said it without heat. "You burn hot and you act fast and you condemn people in public without evidence, and you've been doing it since you were 16, and every time someone cleans it up after you. Every time the kingdom absorbs the damage." Her eyes moved briefly to Celine. "She's been absorbing your damage for 12 years. Did you know that?" Kale said nothing. The eastern border disputes. The winter supply crisis 3 years ago. The trade renegotiation with the mountain clans that should have collapsed and didn't. Morwen's voice was still flat, still factual, delivering an inventory. Every one of those was her, working behind what you'd broken, rebuilding what your pride had damaged, keeping the thing running so you could keep believing the thing ran because of you. The throne room held the words. Let them sit in the torchlight. Celine felt Kyle beside her, felt the specific stillness that was not the dangerous compressed stillness from the banquet hall, but a different kind. The stillness of a man receiving something he had not been prepared to receive and was not going to reject. "You're not wrong," Kyle said. The words landed in the room with the quietness of things that are true and have not been said before and cannot be unsaid. Morwen looked at him. For the first time since Celine had known this woman, something in her face moved that was not controlled. "No," Morwen said. "I'm not wrong." "But you chose to burn it down instead of build it up," Kyle said. "You had 22 years. You could have said any of this, any of it, to me directly. Instead, you built a network inside my walls and forged letters in my wife's name and poisoned soldiers at my table." His voice stayed level. "That's not someone trying to protect a kingdom. That's someone who decided the kingdom belonged to them and stopped asking whether it did." Morwen's jaw tightened. "You wanted it," Kyle said. "Not for the kingdom, for you. Because you're the smartest person in every room you've ever walked into, and you have spent 22 years watching people less capable than you hold the thing you believed you should hold." He looked at her steadily. "I know what that feels like. I've seen it in myself." He paused. "The difference is I had someone willing to stay beside me and tell me when I was wrong. You never allowed yourself that." The silence that followed was not the silence before action. It was the silence after truth. The particular acoustic quality of a room in which something has been said that all the parties present knew was accurate, and none of them were going to deny. The figure with the blade at Bryn's throat shifted his weight. Celine moved. She had not been standing still for the past 90 seconds. She had been standing still in the way that a person stands still, when they are calculating angle and distance and the specific geometry of a room and waiting for the moment when the conversation created the fraction of distraction she needed. The weight shift was the moment, the fighter's attention moving fractionally to his employer's face during the silence, the fraction of a second when the grip on the blade loosened from committed to habitual. She covered the distance in 4 strides and hit the blade arm from below, driving her left forearm into his wrist, and the cut on her arm screamed, but she was past the point where that was a useful input, and the blade came up and away from Bryn's throat. And Bryn, who had been waiting for exactly this and whose hands behind her back had been working the binding since the moment she got her knees under her properly, came up off the floor and drove the crown of her head into the figure's chin with the force of 11 years of frustration and a very direct personality. He went down. The other 2 figures moved toward Kyle. Kyle was not the man who had come through the south wing door without a weapon, because there had been no time to pick one up. In the seconds while Celine had been covering distance, he'd taken the door brace he'd been carrying since the south wing, still in his left hand, because he'd carried it through the fire and through the corridor and through the throne room door without Celine noticing because she'd been occupied with other things. And he'd made the calculation she'd made 30 minutes ago in the burning corridor. The first man he hit clean. The second man got inside the swing of the brace and they went to the floor together, and it was ugly and direct and nothing like ceremony. And Celine registered it peripherally while she was dealing with the fact that Morwen had moved, not toward the doors, not toward the throne, toward the side wall, the east wall, where there was a mounted display of the kingdom's founding documents in their sealed cases, and beside them, a narrow secondary door that led to the throne room's private antechamber. Celine cut across the room. Morwen reached the door first. She had it open, had her hand on the frame, was stepping through, and Celine hit the frame from the other side, and they stood in the doorway with 3 feet between them and Morwen's hand on the door and Celine's hand on the door, and neither of them moving. Morwen looked at her. The exhaustion was fully visible now. The management was gone. What was left in her face was the actual face underneath it, older than the managed version, harder, with the specific lines of a person who had been certain for so long that certainty had worn its own grooves into the bones. "Let me go," Morwen said. "No," Celine said. "You have the records, you have Cassin, you have 5 lords as witnesses." Her voice was still level, but the flatness had texture in it now, the texture of something that was working hard to stay flat. "You don't need me in a cell to prove what happened tonight. You have everything." "I know," Celine said. "Then let me go." "I'm not letting you go because it's convenient for the case," Celine said. "I'm not letting you go because of what you did to me tonight either. I've been in worse situations." She held Morwen's eyes. "I'm not letting you go because if I do, you'll spend the next year rebuilding, and in 3 years there'll be another forged letter with someone else's seal on it, and in 11 years there'll be another Cassin in another corridor laughing at another king's jokes, and someone else will be in that cell." She paused. "I'm not willing to pay that forward." Morwen looked at her for a long moment. "You understand what I was trying to do," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Celine said. "I've understood it for most of tonight. Understanding it doesn't change what I'm going to do about it." Something moved in Morwen's face. The last movement, the final shift, the thing that happened when a person's last position collapsed, and they had nothing left to manage. She let go of the door. Audric's men came through the main doors 40 seconds later. They'd heard the noise and made the correct call about how long to wait. And Celine stepped back and let them take Morwen and the others, and she stood in the throne room and breathed, and the breathing was steadier than she'd expected it to be. Bryn was on her feet, rubbing her wrists where the binding had been, with the expression of someone taking a private inventory of damage and finding the numbers acceptable. She looked at Celine's forearm. "That needs—" "I know," Celine said. "Now," Bryn said. "Yes," Celine said. "Now." Kael was standing near the dais, and he had a cut on his jaw from the second man's elbow, and he was looking at the throne the way people looked at things they'd stopped seeing because they saw them every day and had just recovered the ability to see them clearly. The throne was old, older than Kael, older than his father, older than the version of the keep that currently stood. The wood had been repaired 7 times in the kingdom's history. The iron fittings were original. It was not a beautiful object. It was a durable one. He turned from it when he heard her approach. They stood in the throne room, the 2 of them, with Audric's men moving through the space around them, and the torches doing what torches did, burning, indifferent, throwing shadows that moved with the drafts from the open door. "The cut," he said. "Bryn's handling it." "After," he said. He looked at her arm, then at her face. "After we talk." "We said that already." "I know." He looked at the floor between them for a moment. When he looked up, the rawness was still there, but it had changed in quality. It was not the rawness of a man in shock anymore. It was the rawness of someone who had finished being in shock and was now in the harder territory of reckoning. "I condemned you in public, in front of every territorial lord in the Alliance, on evidence I didn't examine because—" He stopped. He started again. "Because some part of me was looking for a reason to believe it. I won't dress that up." Celine looked at him. "I know why," she said. "I've known for a long time. It doesn't make it acceptable." She held his eyes. "But I'm not interested in telling you why you were wrong. You know why you were wrong. What I'm interested in is whether you know what to do about it. I'll make a public declaration, full exoneration, every lord present, formal record, whatever the protocol requires. That's the procedural part, she said. That's not what I mean. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the room continued its organized aftermath. Audric's voice, the sound of doors, the distant percussion of the fire suppression still running in the yard. The keep was not silent. It was never going to be silent. That was the nature of a keep. It was always running, always producing some layer of consequence or preparation, the machinery of governance operating at the frequency of human need. Celine had spent 12 years learning to work inside that noise. She had decided years ago that it was the work she was built for, not because it was given to her or because her position required it, but because the work of keeping something functional and just was genuinely the thing she was best at. And she had chosen to bring that capacity to bear on this specific kingdom beside this specific man. And she had made that choice with open eyes, and she was going to keep making it. Not because he deserved it. He had not deserved it tonight. Because the kingdom deserved it. Because the lords in their recovered chambers deserved it. Because the guard who'd taken a blade in his side trying to deliver a document to the king deserved to live in a territory that was governed by people who could see past their own pride long enough to protect him. And because underneath all of that, underneath the assessment and the calculation, and the 12 years of learning how to survive a difficult man in a difficult position, she had chosen him. In some part of herself that she had stopped examining because examining it was expensive, she had chosen him, the difficulty and the iron and the moments of grace between the difficult ones, and that choosing was hers. It had always been hers. No one had taken it from her, not even tonight. Build something real, she said, not a better version of what you had, not the same structure with better maintenance, something that doesn't require a person standing behind it, absorbing the damage you create. She paused. You're capable of it. That's the part that's made this hard. You're capable of being better than what you've been, and you've known it, and you've made other choices, and I'm done pretending those choices were inevitable. Kael stood in the torchlight of the throne room he'd held for 12 years and looked at his queen. And what was on his face in that moment was not the face of an alpha king performing authority. It was the face of a man who had been taken apart by a single night and was standing in the pieces of himself, looking at what they actually added up to, without any of the armor he'd spent 43 years building between himself and that assessment. I know, he said. Simple. Direct. The two words with the full weight of someone who had arrived, finally and without shortcuts, at the understanding of what they'd cost the people around them. She nodded. Once, small, the way she nodded when something was sufficient. Get the cut wrapped, she said. He almost smiled. It was a fractional thing, barely a change in his face, a shift in the set of his mouth. But she saw it, and she had learned, over 12 years, to read the fractional things. Yes, he said. Dawn came into Moonfang Keep the way dawn came into stone structures. Slowly, reluctantly, the light working its way through narrow windows before it had the strength to do anything decisive. Celine stood in the outer yard and watched it come. Her arm was wrapped. The keep physician had added 7 stitches with the efficiency of someone who had been woken before dawn and had decided that disapproval was less productive than competence. The south wing was standing. The fire had consumed the interior of the eastern corridor and the records room and nothing beyond. The cistern's 60% had been enough, barely, and the men had worked it right. The documents she'd carried out were intact. All 6 cases sitting now in the main archive room under guard, waiting for the full examination that was going to take weeks, and was going to be, she anticipated, deeply clarifying about the nature of who had been doing what in this territory for the past 11 years. Casson was confined. Morwen was confined. The 3 remaining tunnel fighters had been located. 1 in the underground level, 2 who'd tried to go back through the well shaft and found it sealed, and they were confined. The wounded guard from the corridor was stable, the keep physician reported, and would likely recover full function with adequate rest and the kind of care that Celine was going to personally ensure he received. Lord Heron came out to the yard as the dawn's light started to do something definitive. He was the second person who'd sought her out that morning. The first had been the older sentinel, whose name she'd learned was Garrett, who had come to find her specifically to say that he'd left the post to follow Bryn to Audric, because he'd made a judgment call about where the greater need was, and who had stood in front of her with the bearing of a man who was prepared to accept the consequences of his decision either way. She'd told him it was the right call. She'd told him clearly, directly, looking him in the face, because people who made right calls under difficult pressure deserved to hear it said plainly. He'd nodded and gone back to his post, and she'd watched him go and thought about the ordinary texture of a functional kingdom. The garrets at their posts, the herons at their tables, the young guards running documents through dangerous corridors at night because someone had to, and they were the ones there. The machinery of governance was not kings and queens. It was people like that doing the work that held the structure together at the granular level, mostly unnoticed, mostly unrewarded. She intended to change that, starting now. Heron stopped beside her in the yard and looked at the south wing's scorched face. "It could have been worse," he said. "Yes," she said. "Morwen planned well." "She did," Celine said. "She planned for almost everything." Heron was quiet for a moment. Then, "What didn't she plan for?" Celine considered this. The cell, the iron bar, Edrin and his folded paper, Bryn's access to Audric, Cassen's records sitting in cases on the wrong shelf, the well shaft that should have been decommissioned but hadn't been, which was the mistake she was going to carry, and alongside it the recognition that even mistakes had their own consequences that didn't always run in the expected direction. "She planned for the Queen," Celine said. "She didn't fully plan for what the Queen would do when there was nothing left to lose." She paused. "There's a difference." Heron nodded slowly. The dawn was doing something real now. The yard was coming into color, the gray of stone and the brown of packed earth and the black of the scorched wing, and over all of it, the pale, indifferent blue of a morning sky that had waited out the night without comment and was now simply proceeding. "The Lords will want a formal session," he said, "to hear the evidence, to formalize what happened. I know, when the keep is ready, a week, possibly less. And the Queen's position is what it's always been," Celine said. "Nothing that happened last night changed it. The charges were fabricated. The evidence will prove it. The Lords were present for all of it." She looked at him. "There's nothing to formalize. It was never anything other than what it was." Heron looked at her with an expression that she recognized as the expression of a man who had something to say that he was deciding whether to say. "Say it," she said. "You went back for him," Heron said. "When Morwen had the keep burning and the tunnels open and Cassen confirmed, you had grounds to walk out. Better than grounds." He paused. "You went back into the fire for a man who'd had you chained and thrown in a cell 6 hours earlier." Celine was quiet for a moment. The dawn light moved in the yard. "Yes," she said. "That's going to be the story people tell," Heron said. "Not the letters, not the conspiracy, not even Morwen." He paused again. "They're going to tell the story of what you did when the building was burning." She thought about that. The corridor with the fire in it, the records in their cases, the cut she'd taken going inside someone's reach because the corridor was narrow and there was no other geometry. Kael coming through beside her with a door brace and no strategy except the same one she had, which was, get it done. She hadn't gone back for him because he deserved it. He hadn't, not in the specific hours of that specific night. She had gone back because abandoning a burning building to whoever had set the fire was not a thing she was capable of, and because the man inside the building was also the man who had spent 12 years being difficult and capable and maddening. And occasionally, in the spaces between all of that, genuinely present in a way that had cost him something, and that she had seen and not forgotten. People were not their worst nights. She knew this. She had staked a great deal on knowing it. "Let them tell it," she said. Kael found her in the yard an hour later, when the dawn had finished arriving and the keep was beginning its morning work with the particular doggedness of an institution that had absorbed a great deal and was going to continue functioning regardless. He looked like a man who had not slept, which was accurate, and who had been in several difficult conversations in the intervening hour, which was also accurate. She'd heard from Audric that Kael had gone to the Lord's corridor himself and spoken to each Lord individually, without ceremony, without the throne room's framing or the king's formal register. Just spoken to them. She hadn't heard what he'd said. She didn't need to. He stopped beside her and they stood in the yard together and looked at the south wing. "The records room," he said. "We'll need to rebuild it." Yes. The well shaft needs to be properly sealed, not flagged, sealed. Yes, she said, with a specific dryness that he heard. I know, he said. That one's on both of us. She looked at him. He was looking at the scorched stone with the focused attention of a man who was looking at everything that needed to be done, and for once not separating it into what he was responsible for and what someone else was responsible for. Just looking at all of it as his. The tribunal for Morwen and Cassin, he said. I want you to preside with me, not beside me as a formality. With me, equal judgment, equal voice. She was quiet. It won't be a popular arrangement with some of the lords, she said. I know. Cassin's alliance has 3 other lords who will want to protect their own exposure. They'll push back. I know, he said again. Let them push. He looked at her. I've been making decisions without you for 12 years. Or making them with you and not telling you that's what I was doing. That's finished. She held his eyes. The morning light was full now, the yard lit and clear, and his face in it was the face she'd looked at for 12 years. The iron and the difficulty, and the lines that had come in hard, and the gray at the temples, and the eyes that, when they weren't performing anything, were the eyes of someone who understood more than he usually admitted to. One condition, she said. Name it. You stop mistaking silence for loyalty, she said. Mine and everyone else's. The lords who didn't push back when they should have. The commanders who didn't escalate. The servants who kept their heads down. That culture has been running in this keep for longer than Morwen's network. She used it. Celine paused. It has to change. Not by decree, by practice. By what you do when people tell you things you don't want to hear. He looked at her for a long moment. That's going to be harder than rebuilding the South Wing, he said. Yes, she said. It is. He nodded, the single short nod she recognized, the one that meant he'd received it and was going to carry it. They stood in the yard as the keep came awake around them. The sounds of it, the morning sounds, the kitchen fires starting and the sentinel changes, and the voices of people who had survived a very bad night and were going to continue living in this building and doing the work of it. The ordinary, essential sound of an institution absorbing what had happened and deciding, in its collective human way, to proceed. Celine thought about the cell, the cold of the quarried stone, the wooden bench and the uneven bar, and the folded paper in a boy's shaking hand. She thought about what it had felt like to sit down there and let the anger move through and come out the other side into something cleaner and more useful. She thought about the 12 years and the things they'd cost her and the things they'd made her. And she understood that both sets of accounting were true and that she was going to have to hold them both, going forward, without letting either one cancel the other. She had not been unmade by this night. She had been clarified by it, the way fire clarified things, burning off what was soft and leaving what was true. She was still standing. The kingdom was still standing. The work was not finished. It was, in some real sense, only now beginning. That was enough. Come inside, she said to Kyle. There's work to do. He came.